The war in Europe was a landscape of ash and vengeance. But thousands of miles away, in the quiet wilderness of Canada, a different kind of war was being waged. A group of high-ranking German female officers, captured in the final collapse of the Reich, stepped off a train into a world they didn't recognize. They had been fed a steady diet of propaganda for 12 years. To them, the Allies weren't liberators or captors. They were monsters who executed prisoners. So, when they were led into a clean, brightly lit mess hall, they didn't feel relief. They felt a cold, paralyzing terror. A young Canadian private, barely 20 years old, placed a tray on the table. On it were golden, circular pastries, dusted with a white powder that looked like snow. In the ruins of Berlin, sugar was a ghost of the past. Here, it was abundant. But as the scent of fresh dough filled the room, the senior German officer didn't reach for one. She stared at it with narrowed eyes. She turned to her comrade and whispered a question that would later be recorded in official camp logs. Is this pig food, or is it the way they kill us without wasting a bullet? What these prisoners didn't know was that they were part of a secret Canadian protocol. While the Soviets used labor and the Americans used scale, the Canadians used a weapon far more potent: humanity. They called it the Sweet Front. The goal wasn't just to house the enemy, but to dismantle the Nazi psyche by proving that every lie they had been told about the West was wrong. But on that first morning, as the steam rose from the coffee and the donuts sat untouched, the experiment sat on a knife's edge. One bite could change everything, or it could spark a riot. For nearly 20 minutes, the donuts remained untouched. To us, it's just breakfast. To a fanatical officer of the Third Reich, it was a psychological battlefield. In Berlin, the Goebbels propaganda machine had described Canadian soldiers as uncivilized mountain men and British puppets who slaughtered for sport. If the food was good, it meant the propaganda was a lie. And if the propaganda was a lie, then the cause they had fought for, the lives they had lost, was for nothing. This is why the first bite was so difficult. It wasn't about the taste. It was about the surrender of their reality. Finally, the youngest among them, a girl no older than 19 who had served as a nurse, couldn't resist the hunger any longer. She took a piece, her hands trembling. The other officers watched her, as if they were waiting for her to drop dead. But as the sugar melted on her tongue, her expression changed. Tears began to flow, not from joy, but from the sheer weight of the contrast. While German civilians were eating sawdust bread in cellars under Allied bombs, their enemies were giving them delicacies. The senior officer eventually followed suit. In the camp records, it was noted that the room fell into a haunting silence. The pig food had won, but the donuts were only the beginning of what the Canadians called the luxury front. As these women were moved to their permanent quarters, the shock continued. They found clean sheets, books in German, and, most incredibly, no barbed wire fences in certain sections of the camp. Canada had a problem during the war: a massive shortage of labor. They realized that if they treated the prisoners with respect, they wouldn't need to waste thousands of soldiers guarding them. They could send them to work on farms, in the forests, and in the sugar refineries. It was a gamble of trust that the German High Command would have found insane. To understand the shock of a donut, we must look at what these women left behind. In early 1945, the Third Reich was a hollow shell. Civilians were surviving on ersatz coffee, made from burnt acorns, and bread mixed with sawdust to add volume. The luxury of fat, sugar, and real flour had vanished years ago. When these prisoners saw the abundance of Canada, their first instinct wasn't gratitude. It was suspicion. They believed the Canadians were fattening them up for a public execution, a tactic they had seen used in the East. This psychological trauma was so deep that some women refused to eat for days, convinced the sugar was a mask for cyanide. But this wasn't just kindness. It was high-level intelligence work. The Canadian Department of National Defense had a secret file on prisoner re-education. They realized that a hungry prisoner is a defiant prisoner, but a prisoner who has tasted the comfort of the West is a goldmine of information. While eating their meals, the German officers were observed by bilingual Canadian orderlies who were actually intelligence officers. Every comment about the quality of the food, every comparison to the shortage in Germany, was a data point that helped the Allies understand just how close the German home front was to total collapse. Acquiesced Part 2, Du Rotero Corrido para, SCU Audio. Este texto continúa directamente de onde o interior Peru. Aprofundando a narrativa para alcanzar o tempo desejado com alta ko. Rotero Corrido, Part 2. In a camp near Lethbridge, Alberta, a minor riot broke out. Not over politics, but over a recipe. The German POWs used a strict military hierarchy, demanded to cook their own meals. They couldn't stand the wasteful way Canadians prepared meat. The Canadian response was unexpected. They let them. They gave the Germans access to the kitchens and high-quality ingredients. The result was a strange sight. Nazi officers and Canadian guards trading baking tips. It was the first time the enemy was seen as a human being. This kitchen diplomacy became a blueprint for managing the millions of displaced persons after the war. Canada's vastness was its best prison guard. In the deep woods of Ontario, German labor camps had no fences, because there was nowhere to run. If a prisoner escaped, they faced thousands of miles of wilderness and sub-zero temperatures. So, they worked. They built roads, harvested timber, and worked in the sugar beet fields of Manitoba. They were paid 50 cents a day, a small fortune for a prisoner. They saved this money in camp credits, dreaming of a future that didn't involve trenches or gas masks. For many, the labor wasn't a punishment. It was a sanctuary from the madness of Europe. As the months passed, the line between guard and prisoner began to blur. In small Canadian towns, it wasn't uncommon to see a German POW sitting on a porch with a local family, sharing a beer. This led to a massive scandal in the Canadian press. Newspapers screamed, "Are we coddling the killers of our sons?" The government's reply was cold and calculated. "We are making sure that when these men return to Germany, they carry a virus, the virus of freedom." This was the true strategy, using radical hospitality as a weapon of mass de-radicalization. There's a technical reason why the Canadian method worked so well. The Geneva Convention required prisoners to receive 2,000 calories a day. Canada gave them 3,000. This extra 1,000 calories changed the biology of the prisoners. Their brains, previously locked in survival mode under the Nazi regime, began to function differently. They became less aggressive, more analytical. They started questioning the orders they had followed so blindly. The donut wasn't just a snack. It was a biological tool to reset the human mind after years of starvation and war. Not all prisoners were treated with donuts on a porch. At the top secret Camp X, elite German spies were given a very different sweet front. They were treated to fine wines and steaks, while hidden microphones recorded their every word. They were manipulated into believing that the Allies were so wealthy and so confident that the German victory was a mathematical impossibility. This psychological crushing of the ego was more effective than any interrogation. One spy, after a week of luxury, broke down and revealed the entire U-boat grid in the Atlantic, simply because he felt his cause was primitive compared to the Canadian lifestyle. The most powerful impact of the Canadian camps was felt in the letters sent back to Germany. Millions of letters reached the families of soldiers, describing the heaven in the north. When a mother in a bombed-out Munich basement read that her son was eating donuts and working on a peaceful farm, her will to support the war vanished. These letters acted as a silent artillery, destroying the morale of the German population from the inside out. The Canadian Sweet Front had effectively bypassed the Nazi censors by using the simple truth of a full stomach. But this wasn't easy for everyone. Imagine being a Canadian guard, having just received a letter that your brother was killed by an SS unit in France, and then being ordered to serve fresh donuts and hot coffee to Nazi officers. The tension inside the camps was a powder keg. There were reports of silent standoffs in the kitchens, where the only thing preventing a massacre was the strict military discipline of the Canadians. They were forced to suppress their own grief to maintain the hospitality weapon. It was a silent sacrifice that history rarely mentions. The guards who fought their own hatred to prove that their civilization was superior. In late 1944, a Red Cross delegation arrived to inspect the Canadian camps, expecting to find the usual misery of war. Instead, they found German prisoners who were actually gaining weight. The inspectors were baffled. They recorded interviews with German soldiers who admitted they were afraid to tell their families back home how good the food was, fearing they would be labeled as traitors. This created a secret of plenty. The prisoners lived in a gilded cage, trapped between the comfort of their captivity and the guilt of knowing their own children were starving in the ruins of the Reich. As the war ended, the Canadian government faced a final challenge: how to send these men back. They realized that these prisoners were now a specialized weapon for the post-war era. Each repatriated soldier was a living witness to the success of the West. When they returned to their bombed-out cities, they didn't speak of cruelty. They spoke of the Canadian miracle. They shared stories of the food, the wages, and the respect they received. This virus of freedom spread through the occupation zones, making the task of rebuilding a democratic Germany infinitely easier. The donuts had paved the road for a new Europe. The Canadian experiment with its German prisoners left a legacy far beyond the end of the war. Many of these former soldiers, after being repatriated to a devastated Germany, carried with them not resentment, but a strange sense of gratitude. They became quiet ambassadors for democracy, speaking of a nation that treated its enemies with dignity. This subtle shift in perspective proved vital during the Cold War, as West Germany resisted Soviet influence. The seeds of trust sown with simple acts of kindness grew into a formidable barrier against totalitarianism. It was a victory not won with bullets, but with humanity. We often think of war in terms of grand strategies and massive armies. But the story of the pig food reminds us that the smallest gestures can be the most revolutionary. To the German female officers, that donut was a bridge back to a world they thought had been destroyed by their own ideology. It proved that evil can be loud and destructive, but humanity is quiet, persistent, and incredibly persuasive. It wasn't the sugar that broke them. It was the realization that their enemies saw them as human beings, even when they didn't deserve it. Perhaps the most shocking part of this story is what happened after the guns fell silent in 1945. When the time came for repatriation, thousands of German prisoners didn't want to leave. They had fallen in love with the vast landscapes, the freedom of the prairies, and the kindness of the people who were supposed to be their captors. Over 6,000 former German soldiers eventually returned to Canada as immigrants. They married local women, started businesses, and became part of the very fabric of the nation they once fought to destroy. The pig food had not only saved their lives during the war, it had given them a new home in the peace that followed. The story of the German women prisoners and the Canadian donuts isn't just a footnote in history. It's a powerful lesson in the psychology of conflict and the quiet strength of compassion. It demonstrates that sometimes the most effective weapons are not made of steel, but of sugar and understanding. In a world still grappling with division, the sweet front of Canada offers a timeless reminder. Even in the darkest hours of war, humanity has the power to surprise, to disarm, and ultimately, to rebuild. Today, the camps are gone, replaced by modern farms and quiet forests. But the echo of that strange experiment remains. It stands as a testament to a time when a young nation decided that the best way to defeat an enemy was to show them a better way to live. So, the next time you see a simple donut, remember the prisoners who thought it was poison, and the soldiers who knew it was the key to peace. History isn't just written in blood. Sometimes, it's written in kindness. And that is the most powerful victory of all.